Hi, my name's Harvey Bravman. I'm the producer director of Soul Witness, and I welcome you to our International Holocaust Day Remembrance program. We have a great panel discussion for you. Our theme is why is Holocaust remembrance relevant today? Our moderator is Lauren Bairnsfather, who is the director of the Holocaust Center for Pittsburgh. We have on as panelists Stephen Naron, who is director of the Foruntoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies, Marc Baker, who is president of Combined Jewish Philanthropies, and Robert Trestan, who is the regional director of ADL New England. Lauren, why don't you start our discussion? We're really honored to have you all with us.
Yes, I am so honored to be part of this conversation at such an important time. So I'll say quickly that I got to know Harvey Bravman when he brought the film Soul Witness to Pittsburgh on the 1-year commemoration of the attack on the Tree of Life building. And he brought this film to Pittsburgh to benefit the 3 congregations that met at the Tree of Life. The Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh connects the horrors of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism with injustices of today. We do all of our work through education. We believe that what we learned from the Holocaust is relevant and important for understanding what's happening now. And this is the subject of our conversation today. So what a pleasure to be able to talk about this with all of you. So we're going to start with the value of Holocaust survivor testimony. And I want to direct this question to Stephen from the Foruntoff Video Archive. What do you see as the value of Holocaust survivor testimony?
Thanks, Lauren, for that question, and thanks, Harvey, for organizing this panel. It's really nice to be a part of it. So the value of Holocaust testimony, where do I begin? I could start, I think, and this is where the video archive, the Foruntoff Video Archive really begins, which is it's a value in and of itself for the survivors who gave testimony. So our organization was founded by survivors and children of survivors and other members of the community with a connection to the history of the Holocaust. And really, the opportunity for survivors to come into a studio at Yale, or when we began in the homes of the members of the survivor community, to give testimony, to talk about their entire life story and the pain of remembering what occurred to them and their families during the period that we call the Holocaust, was in itself a service to the survivor community, right? So in a way, our mission sort of ends there at the moment where we give survivors a chance to tell their story and to have a voice. Beyond that, of course, there is really an invaluable historical document that testimony represents, and you can point to hundreds and hundreds of really important works that have been based on testimony or use testimony to make their argument. If we look at one of the important contributions of testimony to the writing of history, is this. It really begins a kind of seismic historiographical shift in how we write and think about the Holocaust, moving from perpetrator documentation, German documents, to the view of the witnesses, the victims, and the survivors. And that's a really important shift in how we think about the history of the Holocaust. And that, I think, is due in great part to testimony.
I suspect we could talk for hours about testimony, and as could Harvey, our host for today. But Harvey, I do want to bring you in because you spent so much time with survivor testimony in creating the film Soul Witness. So what do you see as the value? And of course, there's more than one value, but what do you see?
Our young people learn about history through famous people and famous battles and wars and generals and leaders and in famous like quotes like I've not yet begun to fight, and the only thing to fear is fear itself. And I think when you listen to a survivor, you could see and feel the real collateral damage of what people go through. What I hope that people get from seeing the film, they get exposed to these testimonies for the first time, is no matter how, whatever they think about the world and history and their thoughts of things, they have to do it now, hearing what the experiences of someone who was there, who suffered through it. Stephen and you and others, and Lawrence Langer, who this film was almost like an ode to Lawrence Langer. Have heard so many more things that you just can't hear, and it affects your life, and you have to go through your life knowing this information and knowing what it's like to spend a few minutes in someone else's shoes that experience what the Holocaust really was about.
We're facing a very complicated moment in the United States where I feel like we're seeing history right before our eyes. And we're having this conversation now on the occasion of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is a United Nations holiday set for January 27th, coinciding with the liberation of Auschwitz. Certainly, the word Auschwitz resonates right now after last week when a man marched on the Capitol of the United States wearing a Camp Auschwitz shirt. So it really brings to the fore this discussion of connecting the Holocaust to things that are happening now. And Marc, I would like to direct this question to you. Why should we talk about current events on International Holocaust Remembrance Day? And is this something that feels right to you? Is this something we should be doing?
That's a powerful question. And I come to it both from the lens of my current role as I think about kind of what does it mean to lead a Jewish community in the 21st century, and to build a strong, thriving community that both knows its own history, but that is very much engaged with the world of which we are a part. It feels to me like a particularly critical 21st century American Jewish question, which is kind of how will we use our voices, our privilege, our power to make this world and this society better. And so I think that, you know, to talk about history, to tell our story, to study our texts without thinking about the context in which we're living and what voice they have to contribute to making meaning and making sense of our world, especially when it feels so broken. It feels like not only a missed opportunity, but in some ways an abdication of our Jewish and our moral responsibility. So to me, that's the kind of morality and the kind of the obligating voice of history, is to tell it and to apply it to the contemporary world in which we live. I do want to add a caveat, and here I speak as someone who spent most of my career in education. I do think that often the rush to interpret history through the lens of contemporary events and or to quickly extrapolate onto contemporary events can sometimes do a disservice to the history itself. And I think we need a really rigorous, nuanced process of really mining the stories and the history and understanding it, I would say, on its own terms. And by the way, that's another reason I think why oral history is so powerful. You know, what is a better way to understand history on its own terms than through the experiences of the people who lived it. But I think we need to learn and educate our next generation to move back and forth between being historians and then kind of being moral and responsible citizens who learn from history and then apply it to the world in which we're living.
My training is in history.
Mhm.
So I have the same kind of caution in understanding, you know, what happened last week through a historical lens, because of course it takes time to amass the evidence that you need to understand what's happening, right? And we've heard a lot in Holocaust museums and centers about the dangers of making comparison. And we saw a lot of that and even, you know, decorated historians trying to put what happened last week into historical context, which a lot of us are uncomfortable with, because I'm with you, Marc. It takes a certain amount of, you have to know what you're talking about, what happened last week and what happened 76 years ago, right? We're at the 76th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. I do want to open this question up, and I especially want to bring in Robert, but we're talking about current events, and we're also talking about what we learned from history and from direct testimony from witnesses to the Holocaust. Robert, what is your view on anti-Semitism now, what the risks are, and more broadly talking about that in the context of International Holocaust Remembrance Day?
Anti-Semitism remains front and center for many people in the United States, particularly the Jewish community. In 2019, which is the year that we have the most recent FBI hate crime stats, we saw a 14% increase in hate crimes directed against Jews. And the FBI has been tracking hate crimes in this country since 1990. Every single year, the religious group that is targeted the most is the Jewish community. So the concern about anti-Semitism, the concern about being targeted is very real. And it's very real for many people, both individually and for the institutions, because we know that anti-Semitism, those attacks sometimes are the most personal places, the places where we pray, synagogues, the places where we send our kids to school, and the places where we bury our dead. So it may not be the same as it was, during the Holocaust or the years leading up to it, but I think the fear remains pretty constant for people within the Jewish community in the United States. The other thing that I think is really critical, particularly on a day like this, when we're actually focused on the past, is now that we've completed a mission of giving the survivors a voice, we have a responsibility to make sure that people hear that voice, and that the voices that are now recorded are heard by future leaders, by students. And we are working with school districts across the country. There are 15 states right now in the United States where Holocaust and genocide education is mandatory. So we have a lot of work to do. There are Holocaust and genocide education commissions that have been set up to actually get the voices, the curriculum, and the learning into classrooms. New Hampshire is, a perfect example where they passed a law in July that Governor Sununu signed. And hopefully by next school year, all New Hampshire students are going to have some form of education. They will actually be hearing those voices. And developing those leaders and that moral compass based upon these lessons is critical for the future.
Robert, I want to come back to you because you said that according to 2019 statistics, there's a 14% increase in anti-Semitic hate crimes. I'm wondering if you have at your fingertips the statistic for how many of all hate crimes are anti-Semitic.
Well, the biggest category of hate crimes in the United States has traditionally been race-based, and that's held constant since the data started being recorded. The second category is very often religion. So typically we see about 20% of all hate crimes in the United States under the religion category. And within that, somewhere between 60 to 63% of all the religion-based hate crimes are anti-Jewish, are anti-Semitic. But there's a lot to understand behind these statistics, because you actually have to have a crime committed for something to make it into a hate crime stat. And so we know that people experience anti-Semitism in many ways in daily life that may not rise to the level of a crime. It may not make its way into a statistic. Someone may be harassed in a store. Somebody may be harassed online. Kids may do things in a school or on a college campus, and they may not constitute a crime, but it still may impact someone.
So this is a challenge for all of us to understand when Jews are such a small percentage of the entire population of the United States, that we really have a disproportionate representation in hate crimes, and even that is underreported, as you're saying. So this, I think, is really important context for this conversation. So thank you for filling that in. Opening up to everyone, is there a specifically American kind of anti-Semitism, do you think? Maybe I'll give that over to Marc, because I know your brain is going. I can see it in your eyes.
Obviously, anti-Semitism is a virus that can mutate. I'm sure that Robert and probably others on this call are more expert in anti-Semitism and American anti-Semitism than I am. But a virus that can mutate takes slightly different forms depending on the context in which it manifests. And so I would argue that I'm sure that 21st century American anti-Semitism has unique dimensions to it. One of which I think has to do with our capacity to make sense of the context in which we're living, with the climate and the degree to which the climate we are in permits or even encourages hate, bullying, degradation of all kinds, and a climate that is dividing, othering, and just kind of uncorking, our lesser angels, which we know, that never goes well for the Jews. That just creates fertile ground for all kinds of hate, and anti-Semitism being one of them. I want to come back to the power of the anti-Semitism statistics for a second, because I think another challenge that we face when we talk about knowing our story and understanding our contemporary context, especially with our younger generation within our Jewish community, is this sense that we have to choose between what I call particular and universal values. That we have to kind of choose between a kind of what feels like a survivalism in terms of our own story protecting ourselves, which, by the way, has obviously been the historic stance of the Jewish community, living as an often persecuted minority, worried most about how to survive. That plus a kind of more humanistic, universal sense that, like, right now we have power, we have privilege, we have to worry about hate and bigotry directed toward others. Obviously, that is a false choice. The statistics bear it out. But I want to note that, like, we are fighting a bit of a battle here when it comes to kind of cultivating an understanding, especially, again, within our next generation, that it's not an either or, that actually understanding our own story and being eyes wide open about the hatred directed toward us actually is critical for our own survival and for our own Jewish identities, but also should make us better American citizens, better human beings, and should inspire and motivate us to stand kind of shoulder to shoulder with every other group that is persecuted, toward which hate is directed. That's obviously the power of Robert and ADL's work. But I think we need to unpack this a little bit. And I think it's another reason why Holocaust education and helping especially younger Jews to know our own story is really, really important right now.
Just locally in Massachusetts, within the last, 18 months, we saw a couple of synagogues, attempted firebombing of synagogues. And we saw in Fall River, Massachusetts, in the last 2 years, probably one of the worst Jewish cemetery desecrations, in the country. Probably got a little bit less media because it wasn't, it was in Fall River, smaller city, and not much of a Jewish population any longer. But those are targeted, intentional attacks. And, let's keep in mind that when an institution like that is attacked, you are also attacking all of the individuals, whether they have a personal connection to that cemetery or that synagogue, but it's an attack on the Jewish faith. And so it impacts everybody. And the other thing, following up on what Rabbi Baker just said, is that we see statistically the people that will target Jews, that disseminate and traffic in anti-Semitism, they also traffic in racism. They often traffic in misogyny. They're often part of all of these anti-immigrant movements. And so the people that, are often, making a case against Jews, they're making similar cases against other groups in the country.
Attacks on Jewish people, to me, is attacks on everyone. I heard something last night on MSNBC that really shook me up. And I was up a lot of last night. And I heard more than one member of the House of Representatives, Republican and Democrat, talking about the fear now that goes into their decisions. The fear that if they vote a certain way, that they and their family might be at risk. And those are signs from, I haven't studied the Holocaust. I haven't studied World War II as much as, and Nazism as much as you all probably, but I've studied it quite a bit in the last 5 or 6 years. And to me, that sort of, when fear sets in, when people, the decisions they make are based on fear of being hurt. If you're standing next to someone who is being targeted because they're a Jew, if you speak up to defend them, that you may actually get physically hurt. I think we're entering into this phase in our country where fear has become an element. And when fear becomes an element like this, I fear that there are going to be coordinated attacks in this country.
To your point, I think we're seeing increasingly more and more people being targeted online, and being targeted sometimes just for being who they are. And this is particularly a concern amongst young people. And, part of it is just because there's, there isn't a big digital filter. And people are putting a lot of information about themselves and their views out there. And we see this particularly within school groups where people are conversing, could be in a chat room, could be online. And sometimes there are groups that target others, but sometimes it's just kids being themselves. And then, an outsider or sometimes even an insider sort of grabs onto what may have been said or a photograph. And then suddenly anti-Semitism and racism are part of the discussion. And that makes people scared. And it can escalate very, very quickly. And so that's becoming a part of daily life for so many people. And I think that's one of the reasons why our focus really needs to be on middle and high school kids, because we need to make sure that people have a strong moral compass. But it's when when you see something, say something. We need to have, people need to really, I think, have a pretty firm security awareness now in terms of their daily life, both on a personal level, but also when you're out and about.
I want to add in the dimension of the assault on truth and the assault on history, and the fact that to some degree, to be intellectually rigorous requires courage today, at least in certain contexts. Courage of intellectual convictions, I would say critical thinking and analysis. It requires bravery for all sorts of reasons. In some cases, because of policing certain kinds of inquiry and language, and in other cases, honestly, because of an explicit counter narrative that has no regard for actual intellectual honesty. And I just want to add that dimension to this, because I think the intellectual and the moral are so intertwined here when you talk about an effort to kind of deconstruct any kind of social moral fabric. And when we think about our next generation in particular, but also the general public discourse of which we are a part and hopefully that we're helping to shape, this feels also like a really important piece here. And I think it's relevant, by the way, to Holocaust education, because I mean, what more glaring kind of egregious example of denial of truth and history than Holocaust denial itself. Robert talked earlier about just plain ignorance and the frightening statistics about people who just don't know. That's not even to talk about people who explicitly deny.
Yeah, that's you're absolutely right. The one of the problems that I think we're facing in terms of denial and the attack on truth, and these big lies and medium-sized lies that are sort of percolating up from not just the sort of general populace, but people in positions of power, is very frightening. And in terms of Holocaust education, what it shows is that we need to reestablish the historicity and the history of the Holocaust again and again with each generation. So it's not a sort of one and done effort, right? It's a constant sort of struggle, and it has to be adjusted and reestablished again and again. And I think that there's a certain amount of I don't know what I would call it, but maybe we felt that we'd already fought these struggles in the 80s and 90s and established once and for all, the truth and the truths of the history of the Holocaust. It didn't need to be further established or documented, but I think that everything that we're seeing around us certainly shows that that is not the case.
Up until a few months ago, Holocaust denial was okay, accepted, not a problem on Facebook. It's only in the last couple months that they've made a decision not to allow Holocaust denial on their platform. This is a private company with 2 billion users, and Holocaust denial was, free flowing only up until a few months ago. And that certainly contributes to the beliefs that people have, the stereotypes about the Jewish community, and I would argue fuels anti-Semitism.
I got really alarmed by what I saw as kind of casual Holocaust denial on Facebook through a community leader in Pittsburgh. This was in the summer of 2018, and the form that it took was the Holocaust against the Jews in Germany. So if you really are in tune with the history and you hear that, it's really disturbing, right? Because there were 600,000 Jews in Germany in 1933. So right there are so many areas where that can go wrong. I got engaged in a lot of conversations around Pittsburgh. Then in October of 2018, the attack on the Tree of Life building, right? And so this is a moment where we recognize how dangerous anti-Semitism is, how violent it is, how all of these networks exist in social media and online that law enforcement wasn't even in tune with at that point. So that's a wake-up call, not just for the Jewish community in Pittsburgh, but for the entire Pittsburgh community. So that's the other side of this. People who felt like they belonged in the Squirrel Hill neighborhood then felt like they might be targeted. And of course, they have been targeted. When we talk about members of the government now feeling like they're being threatened, well, now they know what it feels like for most of the Jewish community. And yes, anti-Semitism is connected to all of these other forms of bigotry, racism, xenophobia, misogyny, etc. Now, our government understands, they have also felt comfortable because other people are being targeted, right? So if I can bring us back to this question of Holocaust testimony, what can we learn from it? While all of these things are going on around us, how does it contribute to our understanding of the situation in which we all find ourselves right now?
We have to understand that no historical event is obviously the same as another historical event, but I think we do ourselves a disservice, and the survivors actually a disservice, if we don't allow the space for making sort of critically grounded comparisons. Because if you look at survivors' testimonies themselves, they talk about, they make the comparisons explicitly in their testimonies. Testimonies are recorded in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. They talk about current events, and they themselves see current events through the eye, through their own eyes, and through the sort of lens of what they experienced in Europe during the Second World War. And so I think we also need that to help us understand what's happening around us today, to use their stories as, at the very least, a warning about what potentially can happen in the future. And so I think that listening to survivors, and survivors are not a monolithic group, so some would oppose any sort of idea of a comparison, whereas others would embrace it because they find it intellectually useful. And I think that I would prefer to err on the side of the latter and use their stories as a sort of launching point for to warn our current society about what is possible in the future.
I heard in one testimony a survivor talking about there used to be a UNICEF commercial where there was a child in Africa playing with a little stick with I think a nail or something in it. And she said, with a bloated stomach, and she said it reminded her of the Warsaw Ghetto. And that's what she thought of when she looked at it. And when you watch or spend time watching testimonies, I think it's instructive not only for Holocaust deniers. It would be pretty hard to stay a denier if you watched a, a testimony, but also the amount of vigilance for the rest of us. Because you may not be a Holocaust denier, you know the Holocaust existed, but by watching testimony, you get this other feeling inside of you of making sure that Holocaust denial is just not accepted, because now you want to do something about it when you hear it instead of just being passive. And I think the fear that's, I think, starting to build in our society has to do with people being afraid to step up and being afraid to do what their conscience is telling them to do.
Our collection contains testimonies of survivors, but it also contains testimonies of witnesses, so liberators, for instance. And I know you said Pittsburgh, but I'm thinking of one testimony in particular that we have of an African-American liberator named Leon Bass, who's from Philly. And you know, that recording, that testimony really, I think, shows the power of the sort of comparative moment where we have an African-American soldier flying to or moving to going to Europe and fighting the war, helping to liberate camps, and experiencing the sort of end station of a sort of racial regime, and then returning to his home country where he can't eat or drink a cup of coffee in a restaurant because of the color of his skin. So another racial regime at home. And so I think that, you know, testimony offers a window into that type of, I think, a productive comparative understanding of what we're actually fighting against.
If we want to see hope in all of this, and I think hope is what gets us through, hope is what allows us or empowers us to be morally courageous, is in seeing how everybody came forward, non-Jews from all over the region came forward to support the Jewish community. And then 6 months later, when there was the attack on the mosque in New Zealand, the Jewish community came out to protect the Muslim population here. So, I mean, it's that kind of community support that to me is different in the response to what happened at the Tree of Life, is a sign of what's possible in the future.
And that happened all over the country. Those kind of gatherings and communities coming together. And that's what makes, you know, that's what's different about this moment in the United States right now.
It is a moment of opportunity in the United States, even as we talk about how frightening some things are right now. That there's violent anti-Semitism is not a surprise to any of us on this call, I would say. But that there is resistance to that coming from places where in the past it would not have come should encourage us. It certainly is encouraging to me.
Yeah, and the same could be said for, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, right? That this new sort of rising civil rights effort is, you know, across the board, a multi-racial, multi-ethnic coalition, and I think that is certainly gives us some hope, but you know, insufficient, but it's a beginning.
It won't be easy, that's for sure. And it's actually something that Robert said made me think about this. Um, law enforcement, right, which was sort of under attack so often for existing racism, implicit bias among the police. The Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh works with City of Pittsburgh Police very closely. What we saw last week at the Capitol involved complicity from some police, and also police, one police officer was killed. So we see how complicated that question is too. The Holocaust certainly gives us a lot of examples of how police become complicit. That's an area where I see a lot of room for positive work coming out of the Jewish community. In Pittsburgh, we saw the police running toward bullets, running toward gunfire. That's another thing that we don't see very much in the Holocaust, right? And survivor testimony connects to that too. So, I don't want us to lose sight of, what is bringing us together in this conversation, which is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, when there's so much else we can talk about in this very moment. Harvey and I have continued to work together after he brought the film to Pittsburgh because of his commitment to staying true to what the survivors are saying, even in creating a film that is edited from survivor testimony. I became nervous that with technology, we could have our students, and we're very engaged with students and with teachers, but could have students just pulling pieces from survivor testimony and using them in whatever way they wanted. So Harvey and his example of fidelity to the survivor's message, I think tells us all something. So if in our last remaining minutes together, we could come back to the survivors and what they tell us, any specific messages, Stephen, that you're taking from your collection of survivor testimonies in this moment.
Well, maybe I'll say something about Harvey's film as well, and why, in terms of the educational initiative that it represents, is so appealing to me, and edifying to see the use of our testimonies in this film. One of the things I find that's effective about it is, yes, this fidelity to the story, but also the fact that it's so embedded in the community, right? And so we've been talking a lot about Holocaust education. We need a Holocaust education. We need more and more of it. But maybe, and I don't disagree, but I also think there's a question about quality and quantity as well, and how we do Holocaust education and why we do Holocaust education. Are we using the Holocaust, which is an incredibly complicated series of historical events transpiring across most of Europe in very different ways in every different country, to try and teach our children values like empathy and things like that? Are we trying to teach the history of the Holocaust? Those aren't necessarily the same thing. They don't have to be mutually exclusive, but sometimes I feel that the educational initiatives are not always attuned to those sort of subtleties. On the other hand, a film like Harvey's, about a community, Brookline, of Brookline survivors, and then embedded in the Brookline community, I think is a really important contribution, because I think it brings back to why Holocaust education is important at all. Why should Americans be interested in the history of the Holocaust? It didn't happen in America. It becomes an American story when survivors come and find refuge in this country and rebuild lives here. And the Brookline Project shows how that really, I think, emphasizes that. So I think that's an important contribution. I'd like to see more efforts like that. I think that's an effective educational method.
And that can be a model for, other, cities, towns, communities, school districts across the country. And it really does create that connection amongst young people who might, see this as like, this happened decades ago. This doesn't impact me. I have nothing to do with this. But suddenly it's actually people in their own communities. And I think that's really important for the credibility that leads to the learning.
Students say that they thought that the Holocaust was something that it just happened decades before they were born. And watching the film made it more real for them. It felt like they were listening to their neighbors, that they were listening to, someone that they know's grandmother, that they were listening to their own grandmother. And that also, I think, made them think about what other stories were out there, that everyone has this story that may be different than where they are in Whole Foods at the moment. And to keep in mind when you're connecting with people that they're not just who they are at that moment, they're all the combined experiences through their whole lives. And I think it leads to acceptance of other people by understanding their stories. I really appreciate all of you joining us today. And this was really an incredible conversation. And I just feel really blessed. And I think the community is going to be blessed to experience this conversation with you all. So thank you very much.
Harvey, thank you for bringing me together with this incredible group. And thank you to everyone. Just wow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Harvey. Thanks for this sacred work.
We'll keep moving on.
Hi, my name is Danielle Myers of ADW Video Productions and BrooklineHub.com. BrooklineHub.com is a 501c3 nonprofit online publication dedicated to community building through local reporting and events. Brookline Facing Civil Rights was produced by our founder, Harvey Bravman. The film is about the experiences of African Americans who helped break the wall of segregation that existed in Brookline before the civil rights laws were passed in the 1960s. Last year, the film sold out the Coolidge Corner Theater and included a panel discussion on inclusivity. You can stream the film and the discussion on BrooklineHub.com in exchange for a donation to the Brookline Community Foundation's Safety Net Fund. You can also stream Soul Witness, a film that features interviews with Brookline Holocaust survivors conducted 30 years ago, on soulwitness.org.